continues to consume Baltimore. After a record-breaking year in homicides in 2016, the number has climbed even higher to date. And with the mayhem comes hand-wringing over what to do about it. In the past, the answer has been aggressive policing. Tactics like zero tolerance, mass arrests, and specialized units have been touted by politicians and residents alike, but it hasn't worked. In fact, despite spending billions on law enforcement, crime continues to rise, which is why some have advocated for a different approach. In Baltimore, that has meant in part something called Safe Streets, which aims to cure violence, a program that uses mediation to temper conflicts which often precipitate shootings in Baltimore. But does it work, and is it the best solution for the intractable crime which continues to plague the city? As the first part of our series of panels to answer this question, we have assembled a group of people highly qualified to discuss it. Dr. Daniel Webster is a professor at the Bloomberg School of Public Health and has worked and studied Safe Streets extensively. Nicole Mundell is the executive director of Out for Justice, an ex-offender member-led nonprofit organization, and Eddie Conway is the executive editor for the Real News Network and a former Black Panther. But before we get started, we have a package from reporter Taya Graham.
It was a type of pushback that rarely occurs at City Hall. The Baltimore City Council voting unanimously to cut money from the mayor's budget as part of the ongoing battle over funding priorities. At the center of the conflict, Safe Streets. It's a program which uses community members to mediate disputes, an alternative to policing based on a strategy called Cure Violence.
No, we're not armed with weapons. We armed with knowledge. We armed with street knowledge. We have trainers, and also the trainers cultivated what we already knew and learned, what I was groomed for in the street.
But the program has not been without controversy. Several mediators have been arrested in high-profile, albeit controversial, raids. And there is much debate over how to measure the effectiveness of the program. In the end, the council prevailed, and funding to Safe Streets, nearly $1.6 million, was restored. City Council President Jack Young says it's a small victory in looking for alternative ways to heal one of the most deadly cities in America.
We're going to come up with some strategic cuts so that we can fund these programs, and that's what she's done, and I'm happy about that.
Dr. Russell, let's start with you.
Okay.
Obviously, we've had record violence this year. You've looked at Safe Streets in a quantitative way. Tried to sort of measure whether it's effective in the places where it has been implemented. What does your research show?
So Baltimore started this program, Safe Streets, beginning in 2007, and I was involved in the very early stages in some of the consultations with the city, and of sort of if to do it, where to do it, how to do it, and then to evaluate its impact. I've done a few reports issued at different time intervals, and the program is operated now probably in about 7 or 8 neighborhoods at any given time over that decade. Our most recent analysis that looks at data through 2016, when we average the effects over all those different sites, our estimate is about a 27% reduction in shootings compared to similar areas that did not have the program. So that's very encouraging. The flip side to that is that there has not been as consistent impacts. So there have been several sites that were only implementing for a short time. They were not having impact, and often they then lost their contract from the health department. So I think it is a very, very promising program. Mm-hmm. I have to say I've learned a lot from it, from the outreach staff and the violence interrupters. But I think it's no magic potion, right? Mm-hmm. They are trying to do really incredibly difficult things in some of the most challenging areas with some of the most challenging people. And I feel like to date, over that decade, that aside from the problem that we've only tried this in a really small number of areas, I don't think it's received the full support to be fully effective.
In terms of support from the city, in terms of funding, I mean, what is the issue?
I think of support certainly on the funding side, mm-hmm. but also moral support
from politicians, or
from our leaders, from communities across the board. These individuals are doing very dangerous work for very low pay. They're very committed individuals, and they are not recognized for what they're doing and the impact that they're having. And I feel that I would love for the workers to get paid more. I would love for there to be more financial resources so there are more programs. But I also think they deserve the respect of what they are doing. And that matters not only to those people, you know, doing the work. I think that matters in what does it say about our city? Are we going to reward and recognize peacemakers, people who are going out and trying to make a difference? I think that is very motivating. I know, you know, it matters to me how, if I get some recognition of if I'm doing a good job or not. I think that's the case for anybody. And right now, I feel like the workers have not received the recognition and support that they need to do a really incredibly hard task.
Well, look, let me, you know people who've worked in Safe Streets. I mean, do they feel like they're getting respect? I mean, is there respect for this program in the communities and respect for it? Do they feel like the city, they're getting the support from the city that they need to do their jobs?
I mean, I think they are getting respect from the people in the communities. I mean, when you are someone who has committed to reforming your life after incarceration, and you are consistent in that, and the people in your communities that you had once, you know, walked that very narrow path with, and they now see that you are rebuilding, you're consistent, you want change, and you want to figure out a way to resolve problems, then yes, they have respect in the community. I think that we need more of that.
Yeah.
You know, considering the stigma that's attached to ex-felons every day,
right.
you need to kind of reinforce that good behavior.
Eddie, you knew the guy, one of the people that was sort of initial. What was, like, just to back up a little bit so people understand, what was the basic concept that he was working with? That people go out in the community and they mediate? How would that actually, was that supposed to work from what you understand from how?
Well, I think he developed the concept. Obviously, it developed up in Illinois. Leon Faroux.
Okay.
Right? I think he developed the concept just by looking at the model we used inside the prison system itself. Guys that knew people in different organizations and that had a reputation and a standing on the yard could intervene and resolve conflicts without violence and make deals and agreements among people. And then because of their reputation, they could stand behind those agreements and make sure there wasn't any violation of those agreements. So I think he brought that outside, looking at the program that they had up in Illinois, I believe is School of Social Work, the Violence Interrupted program. And I think they had duplicated one down in New Orleans. And so he said in the community, if people could see people that were respected and recognized, and young people, that is, they would listen more likely to those people in terms of resolving problems, especially if people had the experience of saying, look, I spent 10 years, I spent 20 years in prison. You don't want to go there for something as trivial as this. And I think it was very effective. But obviously, as Dr. Webster said, that in some places it took roots and in other places it didn't. Yeah.
Well, and you got some statistics from the health department, which says there were, about 870 mediated conflicts?
Yeah, 800, just in 2016, 876 interactions, mediations that it was determined that maybe 80% of them would have led to gun violence. Also, 3 out of the 4 sites that Safe Street was operating in 2016 had no gun violence at all that led to fatalities. And in one particular site on the east side, they hadn't had any fatalities at all, right? So, and like Dr. Webster said, it led to, in those sites, a 27% reduction in crime in those areas.
Well, Dr. Webster, given those statistics and given that we're in this crisis, like, why hasn't the city and other agencies stepped in and say, let's fund Safe Street, let's give them 20 million, let's give them 10 million. Forget about, as we know, the mayor said 1.6 million after the council pushed back. I mean, the program had basically been cut. Right. If you say it's successful, and Eddie's got these statistics that seem to indicate, and we have a real crisis, why do you think there's such a reluctance to fund it?
I think part of it has to do with its history and how it came to Baltimore. It came through the health department. Probably, I think a lot of people don't really understand that probably 85% of the funding for the Baltimore City Health Department comes through grants, through federal and state grants and a few private grants. To me, I mean, just wrap your head around that. If you are a health commissioner and you are responsible for the health and safety of an entire city, and you have to go around and begging and pleading and hoping you get grants to keep the city healthy and safe, that's very different from how we think about public safety on the law enforcement side. Yes, the Baltimore Police Department does get grants, but our history has been we have invested in that because our population needs the protection from law enforcement. So I think part of it comes from, this was a public health model from an agency that is almost entirely grant funded. And then the mayor, look, since its inception, I'm not talking about Mayor Pugh, I'm talking about since its inception, very little city money has actually been invested. Mayor Dixon had, I believe, was the exception to put some real money on the table.
But the subsequent administration, Mayor Blake, did not.
She did not. It was mostly grant funded.
Right.
So I think part of it is sort of has to do with its history of how it got here. And what I feel most disappointed about, I feel very good about a lot of its successes that we've been talking about. What I feel disappointed is that over that 10-year span that there wasn't sort of a mobilization for public support that this should be a city-funded operation. This should be part of a public safety strategy that warrants public investment, just as we invest in all kinds of things relevant to our safety, traffic safety, other safety.
Well, could there be a multiplier effect with that kind of thing? If, for example, they funded with 20 million or 30 million, could that, from what your data you're looking at, actually, increase the efficacy of the program in terms of extra funding? So
I do think it would be more effective with more funding. I mean, there's two things about effectiveness. One is, can you go from 27% to 57% reduction or something like that? But I think actually more importantly is sort of how broadly you can apply this program.
Well, that's cool,
and that is, I feel like our leadership should be answering that question, is how can you take something that started as a grant-funded demonstration project. Let's see, this is a new way to approach violence. Let's see if it works. Okay, now we have evidence. It works. The whole idea of a demonstration project, though, is to then say, is this where we can put public dollars for with good return? And I think the answer is yes. The question then is, how do you ramp that up? How do you get citywide effects? And I think part of that is, it's always going to have a neighborhood roots, but you got to make a citywide effort. It's like a citywide statement and a communications strategy around it. It's a campaign. So I think Eddie mentioned New Orleans, for example. They started something called NOLA for Life. The Cure Violence was one, not the only strategy, but it clearly was a broad mobilization. New Orleans recognized homicides and shootings are a huge problem for our city. We're going to invest in this as a city rather than think about, can we find a little grant to get this little neighborhood protected? So that's my own hope and vision, is that we begin to think about safe streets not as, oh, let's do a little demonstration project or get one more neighborhood. I think we need to think about how can we do violence prevention citywide, change cultures, change opportunities, recognize peacemakers and what they're doing. Then you start to change, I think, a culture of violence to to nonviolence.
Nicole, you know, one of the big things in the debate with the mayor or the council was taking money out of the police department. I mean, you know, for years it's been sort of not something you even talk about. And this year was the first time there was even any debate. Do you think the community perceives that this is something that has to be done? Like, for example, if the council said, let's put 100 million in safe streets rather than 100 million in police department, is the community ready for that? Because a lot of council people I talked to said, people are like, don't cut the police department. I mean, what are you seeing from the people in the community? What do you think?
So it depends on what community members you're talking to, right? If you're talking about the most of the community who is most impacted by violence, then they would say, this is a model that works. Let's de-invest, you know, take some money out of the police budget and invest in people that can actually prevent crime, can negotiate problems, you know, can figure out ways for communities to stay safe. When you think about other communities who may get some spurts of violence here and there, they want more police protection. I mean, but at the end of the day, what we have been doing in the police department thus far, from my point of view, and the people who I connect with the most, has not been working.
Right.
And so they are open to new opportunities. This Safe Streets model is something that they can trust, right? These are people that they know, that they have lived with, they have lived beside, who they went to school with, who they saw grow up. And so they are most likely to listen, to negotiate, to work with these individuals rather than a police officer who they've never saw before, don't live in their community. So I think it depends on the community you're talking, you know, the type, you know, what community you're talking about. Right. If you're talking about the most impacted folks, they want a model like Safe Streets. They can trust a model like Safe Streets. If you're talking about a community that's not, you know, they get some spurts of violence here and there, their cars get broken into, things like that, they want more law enforcement.
Well, Eddie, what do you think? I mean, you know, we have seen, we reached a different debate about defunding policing. I mean, is that the best way to address this issue with violence right now, to defund policing and to put it in something else, or what's your take on that idea?
I don't even see it as the issue of defunding the police. Like this year, they added an additional $18 million to their overtime salaries,
yes, that's true.
Which was like $60 million.
Yeah, they had a record.
This is
on
overtime.
That's true.
You know, so it's not a question of defunding. It's a question of putting some of that funds into programs that's successful, but it's got to be a holistic approach. It can't just be that, well, we have violent interrupters out on the community streets and they're interacting with people, but you have to go beyond that and look at what's the source of this violence. The source of this violence is unemployment. The source of this violence is oppression. The source of this violence is the way institutions deal with different races and different communities on an economic level. You need jobs in the community. It's not being addressed. So some of that money needs to be addressed in terms of employing people. People don't want to be out on street corners and fighting over territory and risking their lives for $500 or $600 a week to get shot or to go to jail. People want jobs, but they don't want jobs, and this is a problem, for $8.75 where they have to end up getting some sort of a handout at the end of their pay period.
Or another job.
They want at least the cost of living kind of thing. So like take 8, and I'm just throwing a number out there, take 8 million of that 18 million overtime. That's not defunding the police.
Well,
that's not increasing the occupation, if I could use that term.
Yeah. Dr. Rosa, just to drill down the specifics of what it would mean to take this program further, you know, you mentioned something. When I was a reporter, I covered the murder of a Safe Streets worker, which wasn't really talked about too much. Is a program like this sustainable in the sense that people can be guaranteed some sort of safety? I mean, isn't it kind of dangerous to put people in this situation and at low pay? You know, if you expand this, are you expanding the risk for the people who do these jobs? And do you feel like there's adequate safety for the people who take the risk to go out into the neighborhoods?
So there was a Safe Streets worker who was murdered. My understanding of that situation is that that had actually nothing to do with his direct employment. That had to do with some history. Mm-hmm. All the workers, almost all of them, have some history. And I headed the city's Homicide Review Commission for 2015 and really was able to examine a lot of the specifics around each of these incidents. It's stunning how consistent the theme of somebody's getting even for something, right? And it could have been something that happened a day ago or 5 years ago.
You're talking about motives for murder.
I'm talking about motives, yes I am.
Right.
I think to get more directly to your question about is this a safe occupation to do, I think people understand very well the risk that they're taking. I think the program's been in place for a decade and largely been a very safe endeavor for the workers. They do get training about how to understand sort of the boundaries of what you can and cannot do, and the reason they are hired is because they have very good street instincts. They know people, they know situations, and probably the biggest unanswered question for me is how much could you ramp that up? Because
and that is the essential question.
I've seen people use these, clinical terms of implementation fidelity or something like that, fidelity to a program model. When I talk to the workers themselves and sort of say, wow, I'm seeing more effects here than there, they attribute to these more intangible things of like, these people really got heart. This is their passion, their life, and these people here, it's a paycheck to the next thing or something. So there's a lot that goes into getting the right people to do a very special task, very dangerous task. And so I think that that's sort of a question that should be examined.
How much are they paid on average?
I should know this off the top of my head, but I'm afraid I don't. I think it is roughly in the ballpark of about $30,000 a year.
Okay. And the average police officer makes 70, 80.
Yeah,
at least, and not including overtime, as Eddie pointed out.
They went for a very long time with no annual increase. Yeah. Almost everybody, if you're employed, you're doing your job and everything, you get some increase the next year. They went for many, many years with no increases at all.
What does that say about a program, if we want to implement it, that they're paying people $30,000 at risk of their lives, but police officers can not only get $70,000 or $80,000 to work inside a building, but also collect overtime? I mean, does that mean that this program, that there's a real serious commitment to this?
I mean, yeah, I think it speaks to the level of respect that folks have for this program. And I think it speaks to where folks think, what folks think are more important in this city, and the folks who can work to get that funding and for safe streets. Yeah, I mean, people see that. People see that the police officer makes this much with a gun, health insurance, they have all retirement, but you have these peace officers, right, that have to go inside these communities every day and risk, somebody not forgetting 5 years ago that I said something that you didn't like, and not understanding where that person is mentally right now. He just doesn't care about me or anybody else. So you got these people like taking these really extreme risks and getting $30,000 a year with probably no benefits, right?
They get some benefits, but it's not the same kind of package as a police officer.
It's, and like Eddie said, there's a certain level of wraparound services that are also needed for these individuals. They don't just need employment. They need, access to affordable housing. They need assistance with, child care. They still deal with some of the same, they still deal with issues of reintegrating back into the community in addition to having a job. Right. And so you don't have funding to provide those wraparound services for these individuals.
Okay, I want to get around quickly. Eddie, quickly, is this, you talked about structural issues, structural poverty. are programs like this just basically diverting from the real issue and not worth implementing, or is it better to divert resources because there are going to be conflicts, as Dr. Webster has said? You know, is it just better to just put the money into something that would be more proactive rather than this? I mean, what do you think?
Well, the statistics show that this works, and it's accepted in communities. In some cases, as Dr. Webster said, it has taken root. In other cases, it hasn't. But in those areas that it takes roots, it should have wraparound services. It should be enhanced as much as possible. And I recognize what you were saying about the individuals, their standings and their commitments in terms of whether or not you can duplicate this program and expand it. But unfortunately, there's a tremendous amount of people going in the prison system and coming out of the prison system, changed for the most part, that can provide those services, you know, that are there. I mean, so it's not the lack of individuals in terms of being able to expand the program, but at the same time, it speaks to the value of Black lives. Mm-hmm. Because most of these cases, New Orleans, Illinois, here, you're talking Black lives. Mm-hmm. You're talking Black lives falling, and you're talking Black lives intervening. Mm-hmm. And the value there is always the lowest possible pay, you know. And the money there is always the lowest possible pay. And I mentioned it to you the other day, and it's also a conflict of interest to have this program be successful in terms of community policing when I am buying a house, I'm buying a car, I'm buying a boat, I'm being paid to do that. If you can do that for a third of my paycheck and do it more effectively than I am doing it, then there's a conflict of interest. So then there's an attitude toward what you're doing, because you're taking food off of my table. Right. You're taking the boat out of the bay that I could have, you know. So and it might not be conscious, or it might be unconscious, but there's that disconnect there. There's that disconnect there, and every time you find that one individual or two individuals that might be deviant from the program, you can paint the whole program as a deviant program, whereas when you look into the police department, you always find deviants.
There is some tension there, and I think you're right. You know, the police department doesn't. I think there's a lot of people in the police department like to see safe streets go away. It is amazing, and I think speaks volumes that a program that gets so little funding would be perceived as a threat. But I think there are a lot of people who feel that way. That's true. Just last question. You talked about New Orleans. You're talking about other cities. What can Baltimore learn from other cities that have implemented these programs that might be useful to sort of realizing a vision of making this program more community-wide? I mean, is there anything that we can take away from other cities that you've looked at that Baltimore could kind of graft on or use to advance the program? Yeah, so I mentioned the importance of the New Orleans approach of a citywide and effort that the Cure Violence model was one component of. And I think honestly, that it may be one reason why Safe Streets has been vulnerable in Baltimore. It hasn't been connected enough to other things. It's been too separate. So I think if you create a program that is integrated and people see as part of an overall strategy, you won't have to fight as hard every year to try to get a few nickels in your budget. Well, Dr. Webster, Cole, Eddie, I really appreciate you all having this discussion. I mean, obviously the city is experiencing record violence, and we need to keep having these discussions in order to come up with a solution so that hopefully we can stop this. Okay. This is Stephen Janis. I'm reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore City, Maryland. Thank you for joining us.